Hi all, and welcome to China EVs and More, where my co-host Lei Xing and I will go over some of the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. This week, we are moving the room over to Twitter Spaces, so for those that are joining us for the first time, welcome. And for those that have followed us over from Clubhouse, thank you for being loyal listeners. We will open the room up at around the 40-minute mark to anyone who's keen to ask us any questions. We have one rule. We appreciate vigorous debate, but let's all be considerate and respectful to each other. What Lei and I discussed today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to please connect with us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I am the Managing Director at Sino Auto Insights, a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull some of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at sinoautoinsights.com, which of course I encourage you all to do. Lei, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, sir. And I do sign up for Tu's weekly newsletter. It's always fun to read it.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Lei.
So, good evening from my side. My name is Lei, and I am the former chief editor of China Auto Review, which published newsletters and the only tabloid magazine in English, focused exclusively on the Chinese auto market. I've spent pretty much the last 20 years on the ground in China covering the industry. I am now in the U.S., stuck, sort of, as an independent analyst and consultant, still trying to keep tabs on the rapidly evolving market. Before we get started, maybe a couple of housekeeping issues. This is our first time ever doing our show on Twitter Spaces. So in case we run into any glitches, we apologize in advance. And thank you for your patience and understanding. We will be, figuring out the interface on the fly, and I guess people would request to speak on this interface. So we will invite people up on the stage and ask questions or comments. Now back to the show. This week, it's been a busy week, hasn't it, too?
Oh, man.
Just let me recap a bit, the headlines. So on Monday, Geely and Renault announced that big MOU. I call it Renault's Renaulution and Renaultrection in China.
Renaultrection.
Yeah, resurrection.
Yes.
On Tuesday.
Sounds like something different.
Right.
But, I'll leave that alone.
So on Tuesday and Wednesday, we saw the CPCA and CAAM numbers on July, and in particular, Tesla data, which was shocking yet again. And then on Thursday was a huge day, right? NIO's confirmation of a mass market brand and 3 new models for next year, based on its NT 2.0 platform.
Aggressive.
And Li Auto's somewhat Choppy debuted on Hong Kong. And later, China says no to unapproved OTA upgrades for autonomous driving features and unauthorized share and export of data from ICVs in a new entry administration document published by MIT. And BYD just delivered its first town electric SUV in Norway. I'm tired already.
Well, let me add a couple
reading
things
out
real
those
quick.
Headlines.
Well, let me add a couple things. iWays is considering a U.S. IPO. I think that's worth noting. They're much more conservative in their approach than some of these other Chinese EV companies. They're trying to raise $300 million, I guess, according to a couple of news outlets. Inceptio, which is commercial trucking startup, autonomous vehicle startup, raised $270 million, which is pretty significant. I think Meituan and JD are their largest Chinese backers. The infrastructure bill looks like it's moving forward in the United States, which could help jumpstart the clean tech mobility EV sector in the United States. But I'll hand it back to you, Lei, and You can take it on. Let's talk numbers first.
And Nikola getting that DOE $2 million loan while Trevor Milton is facing charges, right? That was interesting.
We should apply. I think we could get some usage out of some funding for China EVs and more.
So never a dull week in this smart EV mobility space. Maybe with the exception of the Chinese New Year. Even then, there's always, blockbuster news.
Yeah.
So you want to talk about July numbers first?
Let's do July numbers.
Yeah, so as we talk, many times, this is our episode number 27. The secular shift, right, there's no doubt it's happening. So basically in July, based on CAAM numbers, NEV sales or share was 14.5% of the market. Okay, the highest to date.
That number is bananas.
270,000, NEVs, and the January to July year to date share was right around 10%. And that's all happening as the overall market, overall PV and overall auto sales are actually going down year on year. So with that's like overall sales down and NEV sales up, and that drives the share. And 15% on that, to put a kind of a perspective, China's goal for 2025, that was revised last year in the latest NEV plan for the next 15 years, was for NEVs to take 20% of sales by 2025. So this year we're already at 10%.
And let me add, Lei, that these numbers are freaking out the legacy automakers because they're using lower forecast for sure on their financial models from a take rate NEV standpoint. So this squeeze from a passenger vehicle ICE, so PV is passenger vehicle, from an ICE standpoint, the shrink of the overall market and this significant increase unexpected of the NEV market, we expected growth, but not like this, is freaking them out because now they need to pull in products, number one. Number two, the funding that they were forecasting being driven by ICE sales is not going to materialize likely. And so these announcements of 80 billion euro by Volkswagen, where are they going to come up with this if they're not selling millions of ICEs in China? So please go ahead. I just wanted to point that out that, for the EV startups, this is great, but for especially the ones that have the high valuations that have gone public, they can borrow money against their valuations, their shares, and it's free money. But for the legacies, it's really quite a conundrum for them.
Yeah, and good friend of ours asked on LinkedIn, right? We, why this is happening, and I say, the Chinese NEV market, right? It's been over a decade. Okay, so it's been a decade of educating the customers first, from a top-down approach, doing the 10 cities, 1,000 vehicles, putting on the subsidies, educating the customers about, owning an NEV. And it's only the recent couple of years, starting with, NIO, probably the best example of focusing on that ownership experience, which has kind of driven, both the buying a smart EV and also the expectation of how much you would pay, right? Paying over $300,000 RMB, over $50,000. Now it feels like it's normal. It's the same as buying maybe a Passat, Audi, BMW, Mercedes many years ago, right? So I think that's the education has been happening, and only the last couple of years we're seeing this market driven. Tons of these smart EVs on the market, and we got to give credit to Tesla, right? What they've been doing. And this year, this is the third time that I've raised my forecast. So back in April, I said 2.5 million units. In July, I said 2.7. So my latest forecast is 2.8 million units for this year. And this is much more optimistic than CAAM's forecast. I think they're forecasting for the overall market, it's 27 million vehicle sales.
Right.
I think their NEV forecast, I don't remember, but I think it was like below 2.5 million.
Right.
But I mean, my view, it's going to be at least 10%. So if you do the math, 2.8 million, 27 million, right? It'll be right there.
And for those Americans that are listening in, it's not only been 10 to 12 years of the government, and recently 5, 6, 7 years, the private sector educating, creating products, creating features on these products that make it much more normal. But the Chinese government has probably invested almost $80 billion since 2008, I want to say, 2009, when subsidies were launched, and money for R&D, infrastructure. So this goes to show where the United States is versus China when it comes to, if they want to be where China is. It was 10 to 12 years where the initial Chinese government public sector came into play and said, we want to prioritize electric vehicles and clean energy vehicles. And they've invested $80 billion. Recipients of a lot of those subsidies have been Tesla and BYD, just because of the number of cars that they've sold. So it's a time, but it's also a financial commitment that the Chinese government made. So
yeah, and so that's the overall market, and we can sort of talk about kind of the individual players or the segments. Obviously, Tesla was a huge topic for debate in the last few days since the numbers came out. So there's basically two camps, right? One camp is saying, it's start of the quarter, first month of the third quarter, right?
The stands.
No, well, no, I don't want to, I don't want to put, names, or I'm just saying what I see is kind of two camps, right? One camp is Elon Musk, he replied on Twitter himself, right? On what's going on, with the lower Chinese domestic sales numbers and a pretty significant import for July. So the one camp saying, beginning of the quarter export, will be more than the domestic sales. And the other camp, I've also seen that, if you do a year over year and kind of a longer term retrospect, seems that Tesla is falling off a bit. I'm somewhere probably in between, and I think my perspective is that no matter which camp, there's no denying that at this point, Tesla is facing a whole lot more competition from both, the established, whether it's the BYDs or the smart EV players, and the foreign players, right? Volkswagen, we're seeing some encouraging numbers. At least they're climbing back up. So what I'm saying is Tesla no longer enjoys that sort of exclusivity, maybe. We've seen them reduce prices, right? Twice within the last month. First the Model Y and then the Model 3. Tesla is becoming mainstream. I think that's, also one of the reasons that they hired a PR head for new media. And one of the reasons why they're moving sort of away from their showroom style approach, right? We talked about this on the last episode, and moving into kind of the 4S store approach. So I'm not convinced, though, that it's starting to be a downward spiral for Tesla. But I am saying that it's getting a whole lot more cutthroat.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't want to conclude anything on 1 month of numbers, as we always say in this show.
Yeah, I agree. I'll counterpoint to your point. I'm, not saying the sky is falling for Tesla, but 8,000 units, no one's going to convince me that was on purpose, number one. So if we just look at kind of the last few months, Tesla's capacity per month has to be around 30 to 35,000 units, right? So if annual capacity is 500,000 units for Shanghai Giga, they need to be running at around 40,000 to 42,000 units a month. So they're probably not running at full capacity yet, because if you look at total sales numbers, including imports and domestic, the last few months, they've been running around 32,000 in sales. Okay. So I'm assuming that's their capacity. So in hindsight,
well, they reached. I think they've just reached their 450,000 capacity this week. So I mean, 33,000 out of, if you say 40,000, 80%. That's pretty good, right? 75%, I think it's good for capacity utilization.
Mm-hmm. And the one thing that I'm not sure about is whether or not there is truly a supply issue that is causing them not to get to the 40,000 units, or because everybody's kind of saying there's a chip shortage, right? So, and I have the stand that it's not a supply issue, it's a capacity issue, which is more long-term challenge for the sector. And so I think the 8,000 in sales has to raise alarm bells. But they knew that sales were dipping for July 2 weeks into the month, right? So they were expecting that. Now, how they turn around and play offense in the, for the rest of the year is going to be interesting to see, right? Because like you've just alluded to earlier, they're making some strategic changes to how they approach the markets here. They've announced them. And so if there's still strength in the European market, which I think there will be, I think Tesla will be fine overall, but it's going to be much more challenging for them. And I think customer acquisition costs in China will increase fairly significantly for them for the rest of this year. But one thing I did want to point out is that if we're comparing month over month, June to July sales, NEV, if I'm looking at these numbers correctly, July sales was around 271,000 units. That's an annual run rate of 3.25 million units. And last month, June sales were 235,000 units. So there was a 15% month over month increase in sales of NEVs in China. And if we look at Tesla, that fell off a cliff. And I know you're going to be talking about NIO and Li Auto and those guys, but their sales didn't increase month over month by 15%. So even the 4 startups, and again, this is only 1 month, but I want to point this out. Even the 4 startups that we track on a regular basis, or the 3, Li Auto, XPeng, and NIO, with the exception of XPeng, Li Auto and NIO did not grow at 15% month over month. So that also has to be kind of a huge data point for those teams to kind of look at. So,
well, my response to you would be, for Tesla, July was almost like NIO. It was kind of a downer. NIO was flat, right? It was like
flat.
2% down month on month. So I think if you compare it that way, Tesla was a downer. But remember, they announced the standard range Model Y with the LFP at the beginning of July, and deliveries are supposed to start in August.
Right.
So we have to wait and see how that performs this month. Once we get to early September.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't really conclude that this is this is bad. Or by the way, Elon said it was Renaissance and Bosch, right? And then what I thought was interesting was NIO, William Li. He gave specific examples, 3 examples. One was a interior panel supplier based in Nanjing, which was forced to shut down due to the local flare-up of the COVID. And then the Malaysian, I guess one of the suppliers were affected, not only NIO, but other global automakers as well.
Right.
And then third, the German supplier during the flood. I mean, that he gave those examples. But and that's why we're seeing not a significant increase in Q3 guidance, right? Q2 was just under 22,000 units for NIO,
mm-hmm.
and Q3 was 23,000 to 25,000, and they did 7,900, so they're a third of the way there. So if you do the math, right, then they can't get to 10K.
Right.
Probably not in Q3. Hopefully later this year. Yeah. So
August numbers will again be very interesting to see how the chip shortage is managed, if COVID, because I will say the restrictions here have increased over the last few weeks because of some outbreaks in Nanjing. 1 or 2 cases in Shanghai. I think throughout China, there's been 20, 25 little mini outbreaks, which the Chinese government really puts the restrictions down. And so will that have effect on production? I don't believe so. But if William Li is actually calling that out in his earnings, it's something to be looking out for. And depending on, so I would look in Wuhan, I would look in Shanghai, where suppliers are, to see and follow where any outbreaks occur in China, and see how that might affect supply production. But
so, aside from the chip shortage, which is a global problem, the local flare-up of cases in China, COVID cases in China, so far have not affected vehicle assembly, production, right, and suppliers. So I'm crossing my fingers for the rest of the year that this doesn't negatively impact both either production or sales. So far, the general trend, I expect August auto sales will also be down year over year, but NEV sales will continue to, be strong. And, I would be surprised if it falls below, 250,000 any month over the next remaining 5 months, given the seasonality, given the historic trend, and given the market demand, it's there.
And we have to point out that BYD had another strong month, 50,000 units. Wuling had another strong month, 30,000 units. So they're humming along. And so it's more the newer usual suspects will be tracking for August sales.
And do remember, we have a wave of the Wuling Hongguang mini EV wannabes coming onto the market, trying to take away that share of the pie or increase it, right? That's like 30 to 40% of the market, that segment, the sub 100,000 A00 sort of hatchback. Mm-hmm. And then, the Volkswagen, right? The good thing, the Chengdu Motor Show is being held only 2 days later, only 2 days delayed. A lot of new launches going to be announced, including the ID.3. So now they're going to have 5 models for Volkswagen. That's the story that we're really trying to see whether, for Volkswagen. And now NIO is sort of launching its own Volkswagen mass brand, trying to tackle that sort of the middle part of the dumbbell phenomenon that's happening. It'll be exciting to see whether Volkswagen can do it, because they're on the way. I mean, they sold more than 6,000 IDs in July. So we'll see how they do going forward.
You had a really good tweet that summarized what you got out of the earnings call. So why don't you go ahead and talk about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of announcements in a Q2 earnings call and press release. Basically, the mass market brand, right? It's the first time William Li himself has confirmed it after months of rumors. And 3 models off of the NT 2.0 platform next year. I thought that was both surprising yet not surprising. Surprising in the fact that NIO's plan over the years has always been announcing 1 model at the NIO day and then starting delivery the next year. So now for 2022, we're going to have 3 brand new models. So not surprising the fact that we knew this importance of the next generation platform, especially in autonomous driving. I mean, the so-called NAD, I think it's going to be a huge part of it to compete with XPeng, which is all we saw the P5 videos doing the testing, right? So this is an area to watch out. So I think what I'm suspecting is this year is sort of, right? So 2018 ES8, 2019 ES6, 2020 was the EC6. So this year, they don't have any new models. So next year, all of a sudden, they have 3 new models. And one, obviously, he already confirmed is going to be priced slightly below the ES6. So I'm expecting maybe some kind of a 300,000 RMB range, smaller SUV or smaller sedan. So smaller than the ES6 or smaller than the ET7. That's one of the models. The other one from my sources could be an electric MPV, EF9, which I think XPeng is also in the works of launching an electric MPV. It's a whole new market. There's not a player. There's not a single player that has this sort of product. Mm-hmm. And MPV is actually a big segment in the Chinese market. And I guess for the mass market, based on their schedule, mass market brand, maybe they'll announce something maybe for the end of next year and then launch the first models in 2023. Mm-hmm. And this year, end of this year, the NIO Day 2021, which will be held in Suzhou, they'll probably announce the other models for the NT 2.0. And I guess the other part of the earnings call I thought was interesting was that their gross margin prospects. So their vehicle margin long-term goal was 25%. I think it was 20%, just over 20% in Q2. Yeah. And they're expecting a drop in gross profit margins due to the kind of the supply chain issues that William talked about. Mm-hmm. So, we might see a dip by the end of the year, and also a huge investment, $5 billion, right? $5 billion for the whole of this year.
That number surprised me.
Yeah, and they have $7.5 billion. That's in US dollars in the cash reserves. Yeah, I guess.
This earnings call just reminds me of almost a pretty mature car company now, or an EV company. I look at it like, they're building awareness, they're building education, excitement about the brand. Now they just need to go out and execute and make sure the products that they launch in 2022 are what the customers want. Because ultimately, you can have a really cool product, but it's a wrong fit for the market, or the market is moving away from that product. Because again, he's announcing it now, so it's already under development. And even the best automakers have historically laid eggs because the wrong product at the wrong time. So, and it reminded me of Li Auto only having one product. And I used to think that Li Auto only having one, concentrating on one, and an e-rev at that, not even a complete battery electric vehicle, was prudent. But now I feel that Li Auto is actually a bit slow, and maybe that's why there was not so much excitement for the Hong Kong listing, because NIO already has 3 cars. XPeng is launching its 3rd car at the end of this year, and so Li Auto next year will have a battery electric vehicle. They're building a plant, but they're still on car number 1, or vehicle number 1. And so maybe they're being too conservative in upon reflection, because even most of the other EV startups that have started around the same time frame as a NIO or an XPeng, WM, Leap, those guys have multiple vehicles on the road already, right? So I don't know. What do you think? Do you think Li Auto's being a bit too conservative?
Here's the thing. Both William Li and Li Xiang came out of Chinese vertical portals, right? BitAuto and AutoHome, 2 of the top, still right now even, 2 of the top Chinese automotive vertical portals, online portals. So they understand the customers. They're executing via different approaches, right? NIO is with this whole lot of ownership experience and service, whereas Li Auto is just, focusing on everything standardization, no fuss, just one model, you buy it, there's no options to choose. You don't have to worry about range anxiety. But I think now we're seeing, especially with NIO, they used to have one path, right? That one path was the premium smart EV, all focused on service, battery swapping. Now they're branching out to 2 or 3 paths. One path, the mass market, competing with, the Volkswagens. The other path, overseas, right? So William mentioned they've hired a European CEO, right? He confirmed they were going to Germany, right? And they're going to have 1,000 battery swap stations outside of China in the next 4 years. And most of those, are going to be in Europe.
One thing I did see, and it was on the internet, so it must be true, is that Li Auto is looking at production sites in the EU. I think that is a very, very prudent move, because right now, for vehicles shipped from the EU to the United States, there's a 2.5% tariff. So it's basically free. And we know that XPeng, NIO, the big BYD, the big reasons for entering Norway is because there is no duty. So could Li Auto be prioritizing a US entry pretty soon? If they're going to break ground on a facility in the EU before any of the other competitors, I bet that they're looking to enter the US sooner rather than later versus their competitors. So I think that would be a pretty shrewd move on their part, because the US makes a ton of sense within the next 5 years, right?
NIO has a lot more on its hands after this Q2 earnings call that we can foresee. So it's going to juggle, both, the premium, a brand and how to do a mass brand, right? It's a whole other issue. And then at the same time, expanding overseas. And what you were talking about, I bet all of these, XPeng, at least the 3 US listed startups, if not others. Norway is the kind of the
dipping the toe
star for Europe. I am sure they're looking at the US market, right? NIO has an R&D office in Silicon Valley. So, and when you talk about a plant in Europe, I guess I will quote Elon for what he said about Rivian.
Yes.
Adding a second plant. Everybody who's on Twitter, they know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
So I guess it's just a matter of how long into the future. I mean, I'm sure they're looking at it, but there's no no reason why they shouldn't do it, right? Thinking of a plan either in Europe or in the US. I mean, that's long down the road. But I think over the next couple of years, again for Li Auto, you said they're kind of alone with only one model, but they, it's all behind the scenes. Same for NIO. The way they can just, they've been setting up, I think, well prepared. They're not going to announce, out of the blue, the 3 new models, right? So it's just a matter of their internal, kind of phases. And at the end of the day, looking at Li Auto going on to, HK and even domestic Asia, these companies are still cash strapped, right? And again, if we want to compare it to, Tesla, NIO, produced its 100,000 vehicle much faster than Tesla, but to get to 500,000 units, right? To get to 10K a month, to get to 100,000 a month, I'm with Elon over there. So you're still not out of the woods, right?
Oh, I completely agree. And remember that NIO is leaning into the battery swapping. So the level of complexity for NIO to succeed, not only in China long term, but outside of China that's a complex game of public-private funding, support. And that's assuming that most of the products that they ship abroad are well received. And I agree that it would be cool to see one of these guys break ground on an assembly plant in the next 3 years outside of China. But if I was an investor, I would love to see them dominate the China market, because there's so much low-hanging fruit here, right? We just said June to July sales increased by 15%. The Chinese government is assuming that, or is hopeful that 25% of all vehicles, or 20% of all vehicles sold by 2025 are NEVs. We believe that that's going to be smashed before 2025. And so, there's just so much low-hanging fruit here, right?
For NIO, I don't like headlines such as Chinese Tesla rival, blah, blah, who and who, right? But the fact that William said for the mass brand is to be priced below Tesla, but with much better service, then I can understand why. But another thing for NIO, I think William has come to the realization that the capacity that they have with JAC, okay, in order to, build up the volume, ramp up the volume to whatever, 500,000 units, if they do have that internal goal, but they're probably not going to do it with the current NIO lineup.
Or brand.
So that's why they have to go into mass market brand. And you can look at it as a way of, sort of like an interception of what VW, what Tesla, Tesla's we're still talking about a $25,000 car that's being out there somewhere. So maybe in hindsight, Williams Lee's comments kind of confirms Tesla's $25,000 car. Yeah. And they're going to come prepared.
The other thing too is that it's surprising to see that most of the other car makers are using a separate brand to get to the mass market, whereas Tesla, they could probably brand a $25,000 car Tesla and still sell a bunch. And I don't think there's going to be any negative effects to their premium positioned models, whereas obviously NIO either doesn't want to pull down the NIO brand or thinks there's a possibility that it would be difficult to brand a NIO, a $25,000 NIO, rather than just launch a car. They want to create a separate brand. But this all gets back to, and we've talked about this in earlier episodes, and what Tesla is really trying to get to, and that's install base, right? They just want to increase the number of cars for sale, because at $25,000, these guys aren't making a ton of money unless they're selling a boatload of volume. And so if the idea in 5, 6, 7 years is to switch revenue to services, then the low cost vehicle makes a ton of sense, because it's gonna push the volume button more so than an $80,000 or $70,000 ES8 or a $50,000 or $60,000 ES6. So this, you could just assume, but the one thing I also wanted to say, and I'm jumping around a little bit, so I apologize, but at this time next year, Jidu, there's also going to be all these other brands that are going to be launching, right? The Xiaomi. And so that market, and we've said this before in past episodes as well, that $25,000 to $35,000 price range where the P5 currently sits is going to be super, super crowded, and it's going to be super, super cutthroat. We already see that the Volkswagen is initially struggling. You said that their numbers are a little bit better, the ID series anyways, right? And Dees, he alluded to the fact that we need to reach these customers in a different way, right? So that's going to be 2022 and beyond, the mass market $25,000 to $35,000 sedan, crossover, mini SUV or MPV is what you're saying. That's going to be probably the most interesting segment to follow outside of the premium segment. So
yes, I mean, there's still these Chinese new smart EV startups that they haven't even materialized their products yet, and how they're going to compete, how they're going to do, while the NIOs and the Xpongs and the Auto, they become mainstream, right? Almost mainstream. So, I mean, next, by 2025, this is exciting.
So we're moving to 926. So let me, because I'm curious, I want your take on this, because I didn't get a chance to review it that much. Can we move to the ICV and what the MIT announced this week? And maybe you can kind of inform the audience on what they announced this week with smart EVs or ICVs.
Well, some of it was already, I think there was a draft issued earlier in the year. We already talked about this in earlier episodes, that personal data are, collected and from the ICVs should stay within China. And you have to get approval or appraisal if you were to, send these data outside China's borders, right? So that was one of the requirements. And second was the not allowing OTA updates of autonomous driving functions or updated features unless you're approved ahead of time. That was interesting. I thought the third interesting part was this whole thing on hands-off. There was a specific a requirement saying that you have to adapt features that prevent, the drivers or prevent what the guy did on the Li Auto, right? Lying on the driver's seat and using a buckle for the seatbelt, trying to game the system. So I thought that was interesting. But this is kind of small compared to what's going on outside of the mobility industry, what's happening in recent months on education, right? For example, like, Wall Street English, it's shut down. You heard about that?
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's shut down. Things like VIP Kid, how that's affected, both teachers here.
New Oriental?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just saying, recently I feel like, I don't want to get into the political side of it, but it's all a control on everything. We still haven't seen what's going to happen with Didi, right? It's 1.5 months since the announcement, and we're expecting a huge fine, but we haven't seen any announcement yet. The CEOs have been quiet. Several planned IPOs, right, have been suspended on the U.S. Yeah. Although that was it iWays that was supposed to plan U.S. IPO? That was interesting. But this control or oversight, I think it's getting more serious for the ICVs. But on the other hand, as long as you follow the rules, you'll be fine, I guess.
The one thing that I interpreted from these announcements this week was, so traditionally engineering changes in the automotive sector are just, they either improve efficiency in X, fuel efficiency or the speed of a vehicle or the safety of a vehicle. But now it sounds like prior to any engineering changes, which are mostly now software related, the Chinese government wants pre-approval before it gets launched. And I understand the autonomous or ADAS features, they want full compliance and communication as to what the new feature or the over-the-air update does and what capabilities the vehicle has after this update so the consumer knows. But, they're going to, how I interpret that is effectively they need to approve every single engineering change almost to any new smart vehicle before it gets launched to the public, which seems like a pretty heavy hand. Are the automotive companies going to push back? Because, a lot of that stuff is innovation. I think Tesla takes it a little bit too far, and the United States government needs to kind of revisit that. But I look at what's happening in the EU and the United States when it comes to the mobility sector and some of this out of control autopilot stuff and this sleeping while the car is driving. I think the Chinese government sees that and says, we want to completely avoid that kind of thing, right? And so hence we have these updated rules. But I also see that, every single update needs to be vetted first, right? Which is kind of seems a bit onerous, but
yeah, and I mean, regulations wise, it's always a bit behind technology development, technology advancement, and we're seeing this play out everywhere. And now, especially in China, especially the Chinese consumers' appetite and for these smart tech, right? For the convenience. So
one thing I will say from a startup standpoint, it bodes really well for the startups that are doing DMS software or hardware software solutions, DMS meaning driver monitoring systems, because the Chinese government effectively says you're responsible for driver monitoring. If we see another Li Auto thing, you could get into a Li Auto video where the guy was effectively sitting back while the car was driving itself. We see those videos on Twitter all the time in the United States, but it sounds like they want to put a stop to that here at least. And so driver monitoring systems are going to be standard on it and pretty specific and they're going to have to look at every single use case because the user will try, or the driver will obviously try to get around these driver monitoring systems somehow, some way. So they're going to have to be pretty thorough. And then obviously the data monitoring companies that are aligned with the Chinese government or affiliated with the Chinese government, because to your point earlier, the Didi stuff, there was an article by Reuters that said that a data monitoring system was going to help manage Didi's data. So, what implications that has for mobility and the tech sector writ large is still not sure. But Didi pre-IPO is going to look a lot different than Didi post-IPO. So.
Yeah, and also this new ICV requirement, I guess we can think of, could it give the smart EV startups an advantage, especially on autonomous driving, if we were to compare kind of the local R&D and local user-based knowledge compared with Tesla? I mean, over here, right, FSD, the users, they push it out to users, they test it. And whereas in China, I don't know whether it could be an advantage for the smart EV startups on the local, especially on the local autonomous driving features updates where they are more localized sort of way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think number one, Tesla, they're zigging when everybody else is zagging, right? No LiDAR, no HD mapping. So that's completely different. So principally speaking, they're going to be different from everybody everywhere globally. With how they approach this or the challenges or the use cases, but also, and it's a two-way street, right? If the United States decides to similarly restrict or monitor or regulate, then the Chinese domestic players' ADAS systems will be optimized for China unless they have teams of R&D or R&D teams in Europe, big teams. And I'm not talking guys that just localize what they've done in China, but I'm saying complete, because the software stacks and the hardware stacks may be completely different. The HD maps will probably be different in Europe and the United States for these Chinese EV makers. So it's not, I'm just going to, whereas in the past, we just exported cars and maybe we put in some more cup holders, right? But now, to your point, it could be, there's home cooking for the European guys in Europe, the American guys in the United States. And yeah, I just don't know how a NIO system would work like identically if some of the software was replaced, right? The instead of, I'm not sure, I think they use Gauda or I forget what HD mapping system they use, but if they're using Google Maps versus Gauda in China, that alone would affect how the autonomous system would function. So it'll be interesting to see, because as a consumer-facing, customer-friendly ADAS system, can there be a universal system that works in China, Europe, and the United States just as well? Maybe, but sounds like it will be difficult to do that.
Yeah, agree.
So what do you think? Do you want to cover anything else? Because it's almost 9:40. We should probably open it up to see. I know Ruchen had his hand raised up, but he's not raised anymore. What do you think? You want to open it up? Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we can open it up, and also we haven't talked about Geely and Renault, but
oh yeah, that's right. Well, let's talk Geely and Renault until somebody has a question.
Yeah, my initial reaction was two things. Geely's global empire expands, and Renault tries to be relevant again in China. And I think the interesting thing for this cooperation, first of all, it's an MOU, right? So it could expand into, it has to go first into a kind of binding agreement and could expand to other areas as well. But I think the most important thing is hybrids. When everybody's talking about new energy vehicles, hybrids, what the heck, right? And here's the interesting thing that I think people might not know about in China. So last October, there was a energy saving and new energy vehicle technology roadmap 2.0 document that was published. And in that document, they gave out a schedule for, China has let's say 2025, 20% of sales are NEVs, but we still have 80% that are non-NEVs, right? So in that document I just mentioned, they set a 3-phase requirements for hybrid passenger vehicles. The share of hybrid passenger vehicles in that part of the market of non-NEVs in 25, 30, 35, the percentage share is 50%, 75%, and 100%. So that's important to bear in mind. And
Right.
apart from that, I think for Renault, it's, Renault still has 3 joint ventures in China. Do you know that?
Mm-hmm.
They have one that with JMC, with Jiangling, yeah. JMC, not GMC. GMC is the one with the Ford joint venture. But with the group, I don't want to go into details, but they have a joint venture that produces the Dacia Spring that's exported to Europe, okay? They have another joint venture, EGT, with Dongfeng. That was through the Renault-Nissan alliance. And then they have a third joint venture with Brilliance for mostly vans and light buses. And they backed out of the Dongfeng JV last year. So they were focusing on smaller EVs and LCVs.
Mm-hmm.
So for this project, I think hooking up with Geely, I think one of the reasons was the regulation I mentioned. The other reason was Geely, I think, is probably one of the only few that's have done a lot of mild hybrid MHEVs.
Right.
So when they announce numbers, they always say new energy and electrified vehicles, NEEVs, in their monthly numbers. Those include these mild hybrids. Okay. And third, Geely, I mean, they've worked with the Swedes, they work with the Germans, they're working with the British, they work with the Malays. Just add one more. Let's get the French over, right? And maybe I think Renault saw the ability for Geely to be able to have these different relationships and do it well. So I guess they picked Geely. And another thing for Renault, I think this is a personal vendetta for Wei Ming-so, who used to be I think he was the highest level Asian in the Volkswagen Group.
Yes.
Right? He was the vice president for Group China. I think he might have been
on the board.
Yeah, like an EVP level on the group. And also he was the chairman of Mobility Asia, right? So he was at Volkswagen for many, many years. And now he was poached to kind of lead Renault's revolution in China. And this is his first sort of foray, his first course of a NIO, right? So there's a lot of these factors involved that you see this happening.
He basically has to reintroduce Renault to the China market, which is a pretty heavy lift, I think.
For me, especially being a Renault owner, my Renault Megane is gone, by the way. It's sold off to somewhere in Shandong province for like 1,000 RMB or something.
1,000 RMB?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
That's what I was told from a friend of mine.
So you sold it for scrap?
Yeah, almost. I mean, it's a China 3 emissions, so it was going to be scrap anyways. But you can still drive it outside of big cities. So I don't know the exact details, but Renault had its moments in China, right? In the early part of the last decade,
mm-hmm.
With the Kajas and all those SUVs, they were actually doing pretty well. But it's sort of the French just couldn't get their act straight.
Well, we know that they were a bit of a mess, and Stellantis is now trying to press reset. Tavares has taken his time a bit because we talked to the Jeep folks or whatever, and the GAC joint venture between GAC and Jeep, they were a bit anxious to see what Tavares is going to do with that joint venture. So Stellantis has a lot of catching up to do in China with a few different brands. I think that Jeep, a couple of other brands within the Stellantis group have much better prospects in China than Renault. But, Wei Ming has been a veteran of the China market for some time. So, maybe he can turn it around. It's going to be a heavy lift. And I've heard stories about him. So it'll just be interesting to see what they decide to do with Geely, because like you said, Geely is just articulating their grand ambitions globally. They're working with a lot of different companies, and which could be a challenge for them in the future, right? Because they're straddling the line between contract manufacturer and OEM as well. So,
and do remember that Geely and Volvo set up that traditional powertrain joint venture, Orbe, right? Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
That could be utilized, and then basically to open the CMA platform that also Geely and Volvo jointly developed. It's going to be used for the Renault Samsung in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess this is the China, and this is about, Renault going back to China and utilizing Geely resources to kind of add to the South Korea operations. But, as I said, the tides have changed. Now you're seeing kind of a 120-year-old French automaker depending on a 35-year-old Chinese private automaker on technology. That's unheard of. And in China, there's a saying when the joint venture started maybe 30 some years ago, this is 市场换技术, right? So market for technology. I think in the case of Renault and Geely, this is reversed. Now it's technology for market. I don't know if you understand, but I'm trying to. It's no longer the Chinese depending on the foreign automakers.
Right.
It's the other way around, which is just amazing.
Well, at a higher level, I think it 30 years of ICE sales created these expectations out of the legacy automakers of the China market, right? Selling this many units, this much acceptance. But
do bear in mind, Renault is one of the top EV sales leaders globally, if not, in Europe, if not globally, right? With their Zoe, right, that shared the Nissan Leaf, that platform, and quite a few other BEVs. And now for them to kind of avoid that part of the market, which is one that's growing, and looking at the hybrid market, which not many people are looking at, this is something interesting. It also reminds me of, I spoke to Luca Di Maio at the 2019 Shanghai Auto Show. He was kind of low-key. He was the CEO of Seat back then. He was at the Volkswagen Group night. And I just chatted with him, and he's like, 2 years ago, they were still planning to introduce Seat in China as a pure battery electric brand, but that was stopped. He said, I remember very clearly that he said, you need to approach China with a humble attitude, and you need to respect the Chinese market. So in a way, I think this has been brewing for quite a while for Renault to, not only starting from Wei Min So, but starting with Luca, who's been at Audi, right? Audi, Seat, Volkswagen Group. So he knows China, and it's a totally different play, surprising different play. Nobody thought of.
Yeah, both sides. There seem to be some questions in my mind about that partnership, because if I were Geely, I don't know if I'd want to partner with somebody that's clearly on the downside, that is looking to desperately reinvent themselves or resurrect themselves, as you said. That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.